session, documentation, material, and closing. And also in the end, we will be adding a new session, which is certificate awarding. Okay, well, before moving into the next session, let's pray for a moment. Pray, begin. Okay, pray finish. Okay, moving on to the next session is documentation. So please, for all of the attendant, can turn on their camera. Okay. Okay, let's begin from the first slide. And 1, 2, and 3. Okay, on the second slide, and 1, 2, and 3. The third slide, 1, 2, and 3. And fourth slide, 1, 2, and 3. And the last slide, 1, 2, and 3. Okay. Okay, next moving on to the long-awaited session, which is a material that will be delivered by Dr. Dylan Williams himself, and also will be guided by a moderator, which not less extraordinary, Mem Erlina. So Mem Erlina, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Fadil, for the opening. Dylan, see you again. Okay, it's really nice to see you before I'm leaving tomorrow, before my journey to US. So today we are going to talk about, I think you will explain about the virtual laboratory, right? Yeah. So
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, because I'm the one who sent you an email. Okay, for those I think who wants to know more about virtual laboratory, Dylan will, will explain, will discuss. We will have I think an interesting topic today by. He is one of the I think one of the expert from who he's who have done this virtual laboratory previously because of maybe because of the pandemic, COVID-19.
It was a little bit before that, actually. We started. It was about 2017 we started. I
oh
think,
my!
Yeah.
So I think you're the right person to talk to then if you want to talk about the virtual laboratory. So I will give it to you for. So you will present the. You will share us the presentation, right? So
yeah,
probably after. Yeah, later on I will try to translate it in to conclude what is the talking about, and before and after the presentation, and then we'll go to the question and answer session. Yeah,
sounds great. Okay. Yeah, sounds brilliant.
So the time is yours. I will give it to you then.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm just trying to get my computer to do what I need it to do. So, sorry, I'm just struggling to find the specific file that I want to.
That's fine. We have plenty of times here.
It's hidden way down on my list. Oh, there we go. I found it. There we go. So, yeah, you should be hopefully able to see that now.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant.
Okay.
So yeah, thank you very much and good afternoon, everyone. So this talk, as Erlina's just explained, is about using digital tools to help students learn in the lab. And most of what I will talk about is based around the use of simulations to prepare students for the lab experience. And that's the main focus of today. And this project started in about 2017 when we started using the virtual labs. We actually did some preliminary work before that to measure the impact of other types of digital intervention, like using videos, for example. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of laboratory teaching in the UK and the US first. And then I will move on to talk about what we did in our first project, and then I will present some findings from a more recent study that we did with a university in Australia, and that does include some work that was done during the COVID pandemic. So that includes some information about how the simulations were used to help mitigate for loss of lab time during the pandemic. And I know I say this every time we talk, but I do have some slides about how we transferred our group work from face-to-face to virtual, which I might actually present today. I've had them in the presentation each week, but I haven't had enough time to do it because I keep talking for too long. So maybe today I will actually get to talk about that. So we'll start off with a little bit of background or a little bit of context about how laboratory teaching works in the UK and a little bit about how it works in the US. And obviously, regardless of where you are in the world, if you're doing a chemistry degree or a degree that involves a significant amount of chemistry, laboratory teaching is very, very important. It's an integral part of the student's learning experience. And because of its significance, because we're studying such a laboratory-focused subject, our professional bodies like the Royal Society of Chemistry and the American Chemical Society, they actually to meet a set of minimum expectations. So each of those professional bodies sets a minimum standard, usually in terms of number of hours spent in the lab, but also in terms of the types of topics that students do when they're in the lab. And then in order for universities to provide programs that are recognized or accredited by those professional bodies, we need to design a curriculum that includes that, at least that minimum number of hours and at least those learning outcomes that they've stipulated. I'll talk a little bit more about what the RSC and what the ACS expect in a second. So students in the UK come to university with a very wide range of different types of practical experience. So when they arrive at university, we can't really make any assumptions about their experience of practical work. Some schools do an excellent job of teaching students practical chemistry before they come to university. So in some schools, the student will have done practical chemistry every week. They will have done a different type of experiment all the way through their what we call the A level, the qualification students do for the last 2 years before university. So they will do an experiment every week and they'll be very experienced, very proficient, and generally they'll be quite confident in a lab environment. However, some other schools aren't able to do that because they don't have the facilities or they don't have the budget, or sometimes they maybe don't have the time to be able to cover all of that laboratory teaching. And actually at pre-university level, the UK government allows students to successfully complete their qualification with a surprisingly low amount of practical experience. So at pre-university level, some students might look at chemistry and think of it as a largely classroom-based topic or largely theoretical topic. And it does depend somewhat on which school they went to, unfortunately. So when we recruit students from schools, typically we'll have some students who've had lots of practical experience and some students who haven't had very much practical experience at all. Now, one of the things that has been investigated in the UK is what types of students typically lack practical experience when they arrive at university. And it is more statistically likely that students who have minimal practical experience when they arrive at university come from what we call a WP background. WP is a term that we use in the UK. It's called widening participation, and that means a student from a social group that doesn't normally get very well represented in university chemistry. So that could be because it is an economically deprived area. It could be quite a poor area of the country, or it could be because the cultural balance of that specific area tends to go in a different direction where they don't study sciences at university. And what we're trying to do as a nation, we're trying to improve access to science for everyone by improving the quality of experience that students have at school. So there is work being done on improving that practical experience before university, but it has a long way to go And obviously the COVID pandemic actually set that back slightly. It meant that not as much progress was made as we would have liked. So anyway, back to university level. So for a degree program, there in the UK, every chemistry degree will have to have some kind of accreditation. And if a chemistry degree is not accredited, it's simply not competitive. It won't be able to recruit students. So our degree courses are typically accredited by the Royal Society of Chemistry, which is the UK's professional body for chemistry. And the Royal Society of Chemistry asks two things of degree programs that are accredited. The first one is that we meet a minimum number of hours of practical time in our degree programs. So for a 3 years bachelor's degree in chemistry, we need to provide 300 hours minimum of practical experience. And for a 4 years integrated master's degree, which we call the M.Chem, actually most universities call it the M.Chem, Birmingham actually call it the M.Sci, interestingly. It's the same thing. No, it's a 4-year degree. It's like a BSc with an MSc attached to it. So students do it all as one integrated program. They don't have to graduate with a BSc first and then come back. So if the student is doing a 4-year master's level program, then they have to do a minimum of 400 hours. You can see the Royal Society of Chemistry also defines the types of learning activities that we need to do in the laboratory environment. So they want students to get a good grounding in the scientific basis of being an experimental scientist, essentially. They want them to know how to plan and design an experiment, how to conduct an experimental investigation, how to analyze the data and formulate conclusions. So we need to give them experiences that allow them to develop those skills over the course of their degree. We need to give them a very good awareness of safety in the laboratory. So we have to make them very safety conscious. We need them to be familiar with core techniques in laboratory chemistry. So we need them to be able to do purifications, distillation, separation. We need them to be able to do core physical measurements as well. We need to be able to use the spectrometers. So use of a UV vis, an NMR, an infrared spectrometer. Those are the kind of things that would be expected of chemistry graduates in the UK. And they would be expected to use advanced data analysis methods to understand the meaning of the results that they get in the laboratory environment. Now, over in the USA, the American Chemical Society also accredits degrees, and this is the most popular accrediting body in the United States. It also accredits degrees outside of the USA, so anyone in the world can be accredited by either the RSC or the ACS. But to be accredited by the ACS, the program must include a minimum of 400 hours of laboratory experience beyond the introductory laboratory classes that they run at the start of a degree program. So that's quite a substantial amount of practical work. Programs have to instruct students in the aspects of modern chemical safety. So they have to be very aware of not just safety in the laboratory, but also the current state of safety. So they have to learn the lessons as we do, basically. So when somebody publishes something about a new safety protocol, the expectation is undergraduates are just as familiar with it as the academics will be. And they need to be able to work in a laboratory environment in a manner that's appropriate for a chemistry graduate. So they need to develop those same types of skills or same types of learning experiences that students in the UK do. So this demonstrates that the two learned societies in the US and the UK have a huge emphasis on practical work, reflecting its importance in the subject. And as a consequence, we have a duty to do the best that we possibly can in educating our students how to be good laboratory scientists. So that means we devote quite a lot of time to thinking, how can we help our students get the most out of the laboratory experience? Because clearly, if I have an M.Chem student or an M.Sci student who's doing 400 hours of laboratory time, that's quite a lot of time spent in the lab. I need to make sure that they're actually making productive use of that time. I need to make sure it's not just them turning up, going to the laboratory and then signing out at the end of the day and not really doing anything meaningful. I need to make sure they're making most effective use, that they are learning and they are developing. And that's what this talk is about. It's about some of the techniques that we use to help support that. Now, if you look at the literature and you look at some of the challenges that students and instructors face when working in laboratory environments, they do largely center around a relatively small number of themes. And one of the primary themes is the cognitive load associated with performing complex practicals in a relatively short period of time. So some of our lab sessions, for example, in the UK might be as little as 4 hours or 3 hours, even in some universities. So the student might be expected to conduct a full experiment in that 3 or 4 hour period. That can be quite overwhelming. And the amount of information the students would have to process in that time could be overwhelming. So they might be working in a new laboratory, so they might have to familiarize themselves with the environment that they're working in. They might be using new equipment, so they might have to learn what the equipment is, how it works, what it does. They might be doing a new synthesis or a new analysis, so they might need to learn a new technique. Hello? Sorry, someone got a question.
Sorry.
I thought someone had a question.
Okay, no.
Yes, so we so they might have difficulty in learning that new technique. So there are a lot of new things that the students have to think about when they're in that laboratory environment. And sometimes that can be overwhelming. Sometimes that can be so challenging that it makes it, it essentially turns the laboratory into an exercise in following instructions for the students, which is not a very productive learning experience. There's sometimes a lack of confidence the students have when entering the lab, especially at the early stages of the degree program. And that can be particularly important when students have had very limited pre-university practical experience. So we did some preliminary research in 2016, and we found around 60% of our students felt adequately prepared for entering the lab environment, which is reasonably good, but it means that there's a large proportion of our students who have actually feel unprepared for that experience. The confidence level with setting up new experiments was actually less than 70% as well. So that, I mean, again, that is quite worrying for us, because there is about a third of our class who is lacking in confidence in setting up equipment in the laboratory environment. So this is what drove us to change the way we teach lab. This is what encouraged us. This is what made us decide to do some new things in terms of supporting student learning before they come to the lab, but also when they're working in the lab environment. And you can see some example quotes at the bottom there. So understanding some of the techniques was tricky. I felt a bit nervous when using new equipment and glassware. And again, that aligns with some of that literature about the cognitive load that students have to deal with when working in the lab environment. If they're working with new equipment that they're unfamiliar with, that's a new challenge for them to overcome when they're in the lab. They have to work their way around that equipment. They have to understand how to use it safely, what it does, how to get best results out of that, at the same time that they're learning a lot of other new things. So what we wanted to do was to better prepare students for that lab experience, so that they weren't coming into the lab unprepared. They were coming into the lab with a good understanding what it is that they needed to do in order to succeed and learn. So if you think about opportunities to scaffold the laboratory learning experience, we could break learning in the laboratory down into 4 different sections. And I would think of those sections as preparation, and preparation takes place before the students have arrived in the lab. Then we have experiment and analysis, An experiment takes place entirely in the lab. Analysis takes place either entirely or mostly in the lab. And then that is followed on by writing up or concluding and summarizing. And that takes place outside of the lab. So we have some elements of this that are done before the lab that we could call the pre-lab. And we have some things that are done after the lab, which we can call the post-lab. And in terms of when the students are working in the lab environment itself, when they're doing the experiment and they're generating the data, we can provide a lot of support. So the way we run our labs at the University of Leicester and the University of Birmingham, we have a team of staff and postgraduate students supporting students when they're working on the experiments. And you can see some pictures at the bottom of the screen there. So you'll notice we have some people wearing white lab coats. They are the undergraduate students. So they are the students studying the module. And you can see someone in the middle of them wearing a blue lab coat. That person wearing the blue lab coat was one of our PhD students who's helping the students. They are the demonstrator for the experiment. And the way we organize our labs means that typically every group of 12 students will have one postgraduate demonstrator helping them. And then in addition to that, we have a small number of academic staff in the lab as well. We have more senior staff in the lab who move between experiments. And we might have one or two of them in the lab as well. So there's quite a lot of support we provide within the lab environment. The other things that we've done to support lab learning in the lab environment include producing infographics to help students know how to use specific pieces of equipment. So for example, when they use the infrared spectrometer, there's an infographic next to it which shows them what the infrared spectrometer does, how it works, and how to use it safely. So there are lots and lots of things that we can do in the lab quite easily that are under our control. And we've actually been doing this for quite a long time. Now, before the lab begins, when the students are preparing to enter the lab environment, we had done some work in the last 15 years or so on helping students become better prepared for the lab experience. We did this by asking the students to do quizzes. So we set them a short test or a short quiz based on the experiment that they are going to be studying. So we asked students to read about the experiment that they were going to work on, and we gave them some reading to look at. So we gave them 2-3 pages typically of reading for the experiment. Sometimes we give them a bit more reading if it was maybe a physical chemistry experiment or something a bit more complex. And then once they had done that reading, they had to attempt a quiz on the virtual learning environment. And for some courses, we just needed an attempt. So we just needed some evidence the students had logged in and had tried the quiz. But then for some other experiments, we needed evidence that the students had achieved the minimum score. So let's say they had achieved 60% or more, basically. And we've done that for quite a long time. We've been doing that since about 2006, 2007. So that's quite common in the UK. And it's a good way of getting students to engage with the pre-laboratory reading. And it's also a good way of measuring their awareness of the safety aspects of the experiment. Because often the questions on the quiz, some of those questions would focus on safety rather than the actual scientific meaning of the experiment. So we were already doing some things to prepare our students, but the research suggested it was clear that those measures that we'd taken weren't enough to improve student confidence levels. So we still had some work left to do. So there were still opportunities for us to do more. And this is where the 2016-2017 project comes into play. So if we break down what our vision for laboratory teaching was, and we look at the different stages of the look at different stages of the experience. On the right hand side there, you can see more or less the same diagram we had on the previous slide. So we have preparation, experiment, analysis, and report. And those are those same 4 stages that we discussed in the last slide. The first one of those, the green box, preparation, that primarily takes place before students arrive in the lab. So if you look at the diagram on the left, if you look at that list of activities on the left, The first two, laboratory manual and pre-entry quizzes, they take place before the students come to the lab. And that's what we were already doing. We were giving students instructions, background information, and safety information about the experiment in the lab manual. And we give them a paper copy of that so they could actually have a physical copy. And we also made it available online on the virtual learning environment. The pre-entry quiz, like I said, it was largely designed to ensure that students did the reading. It was mainly there to make sure students read the manual, understood the key points, and were able to answer questions about it. The two blue boxes, they were new things that we added in 2016, 2017. So we started making use of instructional videos, and those instructional videos were filmed by our students in our laboratory environment using the equipment that was available to our students. So rather than use generic videos like the ones that the Royal Society of Chemistry produce, we wanted to have videos that took place in our lab and used our equipment so that when students came to view them, they would see things that were familiar from their own lab environment. Sometimes if you use a general video, something that's been produced elsewhere, they will use slightly different equipment, slightly different apparatus. And even if it looks slightly different to what's in your lab, sometimes students fail to make that association, unfortunately. We also looked at the use of simulated versions of the experiments themselves. And specifically, we looked at simulated versions of individual techniques that were embedded in our experimental practice. And this is the main focus of the talk today. The idea behind this is that students can practice a simulated version of the work that they're going to do in the lab before they arrive in the lab using a computer-based simulation. And that means they can make as many mistakes as they like. They can learn through their mistakes. They get feedback from doing this, so they are learning how apparatus works, what is safe, what isn't safe before they arrive in the laboratory. The next element of support that we provide takes place in the lab, and that is the demonstrator briefing. So that is a short talk that the postgraduate gives the students about the experiment at the start of the day. And then the rest of the support takes the form of the interactions the demonstrator has with the student during the lab time and the scaffolded reports that we ask students to write. So we often give students templates to fill in at the end of the experiment. Okay, so I'll briefly talk about the complete picture, a little bit about the videos. Now, I know a lot of universities do this, to be perfectly honest with you, and actually we had piloted a video project a few years earlier. So we did this first time around in about 2010. We generated a series of videos that, because of technological limitations at the time, weren't very well engaged by students. So streaming videos was a lot more difficult in 2010 than it is now. Students often had to download the video. That took time on low-speed internet connections. Devices had much lower memory storage. And as a consequence, a lot of our students didn't really work with them. The resolution of those videos wasn't very good either. So we could film in high resolution, but we couldn't upload it to the VLE in high resolution because it took up too much space. So as a consequence, the videos were not the best quality because of the memory requirements, and they weren't very well engaged with by students because of the limitations of technology of 12 years ago, unfortunately. So when we came back and did it again in 2016, technology had moved on quite a lot. YouTube had become a worldwide phenomenon, so streaming had become very, very common at this point, and all of our students were familiar with streaming. They would all have used this as part of their learning experiences, either at university or at school, but also as part of their social experiences. So they were all very comfortable doing this. Technology had moved on in that half a decade as well, so streaming platforms were much more effective. There was no need to actually download the video anymore. You could stream a good quality version of it off a hosted platform like YouTube, for example. So we made a series of very short, focused videos that were 3 to 5 minutes long, based on some research that suggested that was a kind of sweet spot, if you like. That was a good length of video to retain the attention of the undergraduate. The videos we produced all focused on introductory experiments. So they were all focused on how to use the core techniques that were embedded in the first year of our laboratory program. However, we made them available to all of our students. So even though the students who were making most use of them were first years, we also allowed students in years 2, 3, and 4 to refer back to these videos because they still used those techniques when doing their more complex experiments in their later years. The videos were developed by our own students. So they were developed by final year students who had experience of doing those experiments when they were in first year. And it uses the equipment that we had available in the lab. So you can see it's not the best equipment in the world, actually. So you can see quite an old heating mantle there. We've replaced, the University of Leicester has replaced all of those since 2016, 2017. But this is the equipment the students would be used to. You can see the condenser tubing and the pressure tubing and the colors that the students were used to seeing in our laboratory. It was all filmed in the lab, all filmed with our equipment. You can also see we put captions at the bottom of the videos, so there are subtitles on the videos, which means it improves the accessibility of the videos. It makes it easier for students who are hard of hearing, for example, to understand what is being said. It also makes it easier if the students struggle to understand an accent of the presenter. So, like I said, I want to spend most of the time talking about the simulations because that's what I find really exciting. And our simulations were produced by a company called Learning Science. And we originally invested in the simulations at Leicester in January of 2017. So we had them for the second half of the 2016-17 academic year. And what we did at the start of the second semester, we spent a lot of time embedding links to the relevant simulations on Blackboard, our virtual learning environment. So what we did, we signposted students to the relevant simulations when they were working through the Blackboard resources for that experiment. The simulations focused on setting up experiments, and they focused on specific techniques that students would be using in the lab environment. So there was quite a wide range of different types of simulations that we had available to students. Some of them were based very much on routine procedures that we'd expect students to use a lot. But we also had some simulations that focused on specialist techniques and specialist instruments that were maybe only used once or twice in the course. So it was a good way of helping reinforce how to use the very common techniques and very common apparatus, but it was also a good way of providing students with the skill set to do the one-off experiments that they would occasionally do as well. So the simulations were really flexible. They were used by students in a variety of different ways, as we'll see in a second. So you can see we've got 2 photos here. We actually did stage these photos. We asked our students to take them. So the photo at the top is, that was one of our undergraduate students called Nikita, who is studying one of the laboratory simulations at home. So you can see she's at home there. She's not at university, and she's engaging with that simulation perhaps a day or 2 days before the experiment takes place. The other thing that we did, we managed to equip our laboratory with some computers. We didn't previously have computers in the lab, apart from one to run the gas chromatography and a few for the UV vis absorption spectrometer, but we didn't have any other computers. What we did, we ordered some additional computers and we put one at the end of every bay that the students were working in. And the reason for that is we wanted students to be able to refer to the simulations during the lab session in case they wanted to recap how certain pieces of equipment worked. You can see the image at the bottom there. We got 2 of our undergraduate students looking very carefully at one of the simulations. I'm trying to say my eyesight isn't good enough to see what that is, unfortunately. I can't tell you which technique that is, but they're looking at one of the simulations to give them a little recap whilst they're in the lab. Now, I don't think we were prepared for just how popular and effective these simulations were going to be. I think we had a suspicion that they were going to be really good. And I think Learning Science did a really, really good job in persuading us that they were going to work. However, they worked much better than we'd anticipated. And we were one of the first universities anywhere to use these simulations. I think we were in the first 5 universities to use them. Now, in the UK now, this is very common. Most universities use this technology in their lab teaching, but we were one of the first universities to adopt it. And we used that as an opportunity to do some of the fundamental research on the effectiveness of the tools. Just to give you a bit of background on how these simulations work, I've got 2 animations here that show you some examples of what they look like from the student perspective. So you can see that the simulation starts with a little one slide briefing on what the technique is all about. So it tells the student what they're going to be studying. And then for this one, you can see they're setting up a condenser. They're doing a condensation reaction, and they're given a number of different things that they can adapt when they're doing this. So they've got some apparatus on the right-hand side that they can drag into the correct place. And on the left-hand side, they've got some controls. They've got the thermometer position, and they've got the level of heat provided to the flask. And then at the top, they've got 2 switches that control the flow of water through the condenser. So you can see you can turn the water on or off, and you can control the way control the way the water is flowing through the condenser itself. And you can see it's very picky. It's very real life. You can see the condenser tubing will drop off if you don't put a clip on there, for example, which is a really good lesson for students to learn before they arrive in the lab environment. So we do encourage students to do these simulations as thoroughly as possible in order to understand what it is that they need to do. Now, what you'll notice here is the students have set the it's been set up incorrectly. The condenser tubing hasn't been secured to the taps. As a consequence, water is leaking out. When that goes wrong, when that happens, the simulation gives the students real-time feedback, and it tells them to try it again. Basically, it gives them the opportunity to try the simulation again. You can see in this run through here, there are a number of different mistakes that have been made in the first attempt, and then in the second attempt, they've done a much better job, but it's still not quite right because the tubing falls off, so they need to secure that in place. This is another simulation. This uses the rotary evaporator. Again, you can see that real-time feedback coming in as soon as the students turn the simulation on. So if they set the simulation up and they start the experiment and they haven't got it set up correctly, the simulation will tell them very specifically what it is that they've done incorrectly. So they will tell them, for example, here they've tried to close the air inlet before the vacuum was turned on. And as a consequence, the dialog box has popped up, giving them some additional feedback. The way we have this set up for our students, we allow them to do it an unlimited number of times. And we told them that. We encouraged them to do it as many times as they felt they needed to do it. We also told them that their work was not assessed. So they had as many attempts as they needed, and they weren't being judged or assessed based on the quality of what they were doing. We thought that was very important because we wanted to ensure the students saw this as a safe environment to make mistakes in. We didn't want them to worry too much about making mistakes in this simulated environment, because actually making the mistakes here helps them avoid making the mistakes in the laboratory environment itself. So we wanted to take the pressure off and tell them it wasn't assessed. So in terms of student engagement, the video resources were quite well used. They were viewed about 62 times per video per week on average, which is a fairly good level of engagement. That's actually higher than the number of students doing each of those experiments each week, so it's good. Lab simulations were phenomenally well used. So each simulation was accessed on average 5.1 times per week per student. So that is an incredibly good score. It means the typical student at Leicester was engaging with those simulations more than 5 times a week, which was absolutely phenomenal, absolutely brilliant. In terms of the feedback methodology, in terms of the research that underpinned this, we used 3 methods to collect feedback from the students. We used our student staff committee meetings. So the student staff committee typically meets once per month, all the way through the academic year. And they provide feedback on things that they've encountered in the course, things that they like, and things that maybe they don't like. So we asked them specifically to give us feedback in those meetings. We also conducted some research interviews with individual students in order to get more depth in the responses that we were collecting. And we also generated some questionnaires based on a series of Likert scale statements. So we asked students to state their level of agreement with different statements, which were largely based around self-reported confidence levels and self-reported efficacy in using different techniques in the lab. So if we look at the relatively simple data, the relatively straight, easy to access data, and we look at how students used the simulations. So initially, when we first developed this package of simulations, we only made them available to Year 1 students. So in the 2016-17 academic year, when we used these in semester 2, they were only released to the first years, and we used that as a pilot. We used that as an opportunity to learn more about how students engaged with them before we made them available to every student in the 2017-18 academic year. And it was a really useful period of time, actually. It gave us some good insight on how popular they were, which simulations were more popular than others, perhaps which simulations we would benefit from adding to the ones we already had, and how best to signpost and communicate information about the simulations to students. So in that pilot phase, the distribution of views was split across the entire week, which is quite interesting. So it didn't drop down to 0 on any day, even at the weekend, where in the UK students do typically make the most of their weekends. So they do enjoy having a bit of downtime where they're not working. The laboratory session itself took place on a Wednesday. You can see the most popular day, as you'd expect, is the day before. So it's Tuesday. That's the day students that gets the most views for our lab simulations, or most interactions with our lab simulations. But you can also see there's quite a significant number of those interactions on the lab day itself. So you can see somewhere between 15 and 20% of the interactions that happen take place during the lab, on the lab day. So that's either while students are waiting to go into the laboratory, or it's while students are in the laboratory environment itself. Because as I told you earlier, we had some computers available for students to watch to engage with the simulations live in the lab. So we wanted to make learning as accessible as possible, and we wanted to help students with a range of different learning needs. So we actually investigated whether there was a specific impact on students who had very, very specific learning needs. So we looked at students, we asked students to identify whether they had dyslexia, dyspraxia, attention deficit disorder, anxiety. And what we found was that the students who reported having one of these learning issues had a higher level of engagement with the simulations than the rest of the student body, than the rest of the cohort. So the average level of access with these simulations was higher for the students who had these self-reported issues of dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADD, and anxiety than it was for the rest of the cohort. That was a really interesting finding. It was very important for us because we're working hard to better support students with a range of different learning needs. And as a consequence, what we're trying to do is provide a variety of different experiences the students can engage with in different ways. And this was very effective in engaging with that particular part of our class. These are some examples of student feedback that were given either in the interviews or in the questionnaires that were recorded at the time. I don't think these appeared in the publication, actually. I think some of them, one or two of them might have, but not all of them, certainly. And you can see the students, some students felt that they were more efficient, that they were working faster in the lab because they were familiar with the techniques when they arrived. Some students reported that the simulations gave them more confidence in the laboratory environment because they had some awareness of how the equipment worked, so they didn't have to do as many things for the first time when they were in the lab at all. So they said it wasn't less stressful. Some students said it actually helped them with the assessment after the lab. So some students said it helped them write the report up or the pro forma up because they were able to comment on what should have happened, and they were able to talk about any errors that occurred in the actual experiment. So that was really interesting. That was probably beyond our expectations. It helped students think critically about the experiment that they did in the lab. It helped them understand where things had gone wrong and maybe think about why those things had gone wrong. That was something we really didn't expect. So that was an excellent finding for us. Now, in terms of some of the responses to Likert statements that we prepared, we asked two groups of students to do the same questionnaire. And those questionnaires, like I said, it were based on competency statements. I could set up apparatus, for example, and they were based on confidence statements. And they were also asked statements about the experiences that they had, such as the one on the screen there about the pre-laboratory experience. So for the students who responded to this before the simulation started, the pre-laboratory experience involved reading the manual and answering the quiz questions based on their reading. For the students who'd experienced the simulations, so the ones with the orange bar, they also had access to the lab simulations. So what we can see here, the confidence level in setting up experiments goes up after the simulations became available, and the pre-lab experience is deemed more suitable preparation for the lab learning session after the availability of the simulations. Now, unfortunately, because of the relatively small cohort sizes and the fairly small differences, these are actually not statistically significant differences. But it is quite interesting that even in a kind of pilot phase implementation, we were starting to see some indications that there was an impact of making these simulations available. This was a little bit of additional student feedback. And again, it's Likert scale data. These are levels of either agreement or strongly agreement combined together. And you can see pre and post. So these are some very specific questions about different techniques students encounter in the lab. So using the UV visible absorption spectrometer, operating a reflux condenser, and setting up a reflux condenser. These are all things that appeared in the simulations. So this is why we chose to ask about these techniques. And again, you can see small increases in the level of agreement after the simulations became available for all three of these. So the pre-simulation cohort, it's around 70 to 75% agreement. For the post-simulation cohort, it's 80 to 90% agreement. So we're starting to see that impact on the students' self-reported efficacy in the laboratory environment. We saw that very early on. This was within the first 3 or 4 months of using the simulations. Now we baselined the impact on performance against the previous academic year's cohort. So we kind of used the 2015-16 cohort as the benchmark. They were the control group, if you like, because we didn't have the simulations available. So when we compared performance in the semester 2 lab class for our year 1 students, we did see an increase in the average score for the class. So it increased from between 65 and 70 to between 70 and 75. So quite a modest increase there. And where we tried to measure the effect size, there we saw that there was a moderate effect size measured by Cohen's d on student performance. So we did this work a few years ago, And like I said, we were absolutely delighted with the outcomes. We were really, really excited about what we found out, because it became very clear at a very early stage that the simulations were doing a good job of better preparing our students for the practical sessions. And they were making, it was impacting on the affective domain quite significantly. So we were seeing students' attitudes towards those lab experiences changing quite dramatically. And a lot of that came down to the fact that their confidence levels were increasing and their anxiety levels were decreasing as they engaged with those simulations. So students became more confident towards the lab in general and in using specific techniques. And we decided at the end of this pilot, because we just paid a very small amount for the simulations to start with, because the software developer didn't have many customers and they were keen to develop a loyal customer base. They gave us quite a good deal initially, and they gave us quite a big discount just to have it for 6 months and to evaluate how effective it was. And we had to do this research project to actually make the business case for the university to invest in it in the long term. Because the university provided us with the cash for the pilot implementation, because it wasn't a lot of money, but the full subscription was much more expensive. And as a consequence, we had to make deliver a presentation to our college leadership team. We had to provide statistics, evidence, and data to prove that the university would get value for money for this. So this is why we did the research project. We actually published the research eventually. We got it published in Journal of Chemical Education. But the main reason we did the research was to convince our managers that they should be investing in the technology. Now, I'm pleased to say the university agreed with our data and agreed with the results that we had and decided to invest in a full subscription. And what happened next was we started working with Learning Science on developing some more customized simulations for the specific experiments that we were running at Leicester. So it was a really good opportunity for us to develop some bespoke simulations for some of the experiments that we run that maybe aren't necessarily common to every university in the UK. We've also looked at doing some other things as well. We've also looked at the possibility of integrating some elements of simulations into the pre-lab tests. We have to be very careful with that, actually, because we didn't want to make students feel like they were under pressure doing them. We wanted students to feel safe to make mistakes, obviously. So we made it essentially just pass fail. They just had to demonstrate that they had done the simulation before entering the lab. And if they had, that was fine. We would let them do the experiment. We worked with Learning Science to develop some new post-lab resources. Those post-lab resources built on the simulations, they were called smart worksheets, and they allowed students to enter their experimental data and gave them an interactive platform for them to essentially write their report. And it really helped them writing up the report because it gave them a structure to work around. It automatically marked their work as well. So if there was calculated values involved, like in an analytical experiment or a physical experiment, for example, the smart worksheet would calculate the value immediately, and it could give the student instant feedback if we wanted it to do that. So it was a really, really good way of measuring the of extending what we had already done into assessment rather than just preparation. So this is the team that worked on that initial pilot. So there's 3 of us who are working at the University of Leicester, 2 for Learning Science. So you can see on the left-hand side, that's Dr. Barbara Villa-Marcos, who's now at the University of Nottingham. It's me stood next to her there, and obviously I'm now at the University of Birmingham. Next to there's the other side of the periodic table in the blue shirt, that's Ian, who works at Learning Science. So he was our lead contact at Learning Science throughout the pilot. In the middle on the right-hand side is Dr. Richard Blackburn, who's still at Leicester. He's the Director of Education for Chemistry at Leicester. And then on the far right side in the white shirt is Stan from Learning Science, who was one of the leaders of the company. So we had a really good time doing this. We really enjoyed doing this because it was something that had a lot of impact on our students that we were able to demonstrate. And then we were able to take that argument, present it to university leaders, and get that implementation embedded fully in the curriculum. That was a really exciting thing to be involved in. What we wanted to do next was to learn a little bit more about the impact that the simulations had on students globally or outside of a Leicester context. And I think one of the limitations that we had all the way through our experiment was our cohort size is quite small. So in Leicester, we have a cohort size which is typically around 100 students. In a very good year, we might get 120 students. In a bad year, we might get less than 100 students. So the cohort size is quite a limiting factor when you want to do quantitative research, unfortunately, in the UK. Typically, chemistry departments recruit fairly small numbers. The biggest chemistry departments have about 200 students. The average is about 100, and there are quite a few departments that have significantly less than 100, actually. So in order to gain a deeper insight, we decided to work with a research partner. And our research partner in this next stage of the investigation was University of New South Wales. And we worked with Stephen George Williams and Shane Wilkinson at University of New South Wales, Australia. And when you see their cohort size, I think you might understand why. So this is a kind of overview of what we did in this Anglo-Australian collaboration between 2019 and 2021. So this was a direct follow-up to the original evaluation that we published in J.Chem Ed in 2019 that was based on the work that I've just described. And the idea of this follow-up study was to do a qualitative investigation. So there was some element of kind of mixed methods going on here, but it was to do some qualitative research with a cohort of students that allowed us to learn more about the perceptions students had about these lab simulations in the first year of their course. And just to kind of reassure you before we go into the details here, the findings were actually very, very similar to the findings we had in the pilot project at Leicester. So again, the majority of students had a positive experience, and this research project actually spanned across the COVID-19 pandemic. So it started before it, but it ended during it, which meant we were able to use that as an opportunity to learn about the impact of the simulations on student attitudes and performance during the pandemic. We learned the students became less anxious about working in the laboratory environment, and they were more excited and looking forward to working in the lab more as a consequence of the preparation the simulations were giving them. So this is very well aligned with what we've just described in the pilot, which is great. But this time we had a really substantial body of evidence to back it up. So the context, like I said, it took place in Australia, it took place in the University of New South Wales. And again, it was based on the first year chemistry cohort. And one of the reasons we used the first year cohort was with the study we used in Leicester, which was also first year, but it was also because of the size of the cohort. So they ran the laboratory module in semester 1 and semester 2. In semester 1, they had between 2,000 to 2,500 students registered on their course. And that, to us, that is a phenomenal number. It would take the University of Leicester 20 years to recruit that many chemistry students. So that is one academic year. In fact, that is just one term. In the second semester, they had between 1,000 and 1,500 doing the chemistry class, doing the laboratory class. So these are outstanding numbers. And obviously, these are not all chemistry majors. This is one of the big differences between the UK and Australia. In the UK, the only students who do the chemistry labs in the School of Chemistry are the students who are studying chemistry as a major. In Australia, class will be taken by a wide variety of different students. And that includes the chemistry majors, but it also includes majors on other subjects like physics and engineering and biology. It also includes students who are taking non-science majors. And actually, when you look at the data, only 1 in 5 of the students who take that first year laboratory class actually continue to take the second year chemistry course. So it's quite interesting that the majority of students who do those first year chemistry labs in Australia, in University of New South Wales, the majority of them don't continue to do chemistry beyond first year, which is very, very different to the UK. The students we have in first year, we will still have them in third year. And some of those we'll still have in fourth year if they choose to do an integrated master's. So before the COVID-19 pandemic, the course was set up in a way that students would complete at least 8 3-hour lab sessions per semester. That was obviously adapted, that was obviously changed during the pandemic. There was quite a strict lockdown in Australia. In semester 1, the laboratories were entirely replaced by simulated experiments or dry experiments. In semester 2, the face-to-face lab reopened, so students were able to come back into the laboratory environment, but only if they were able to. If they weren't able to, because they were ill, or they lived remotely in a place where they weren't able to travel because of government restrictions, they were still able to do simulated versions of those experiments. So it was a kind of hybrid format in semester 2. So the research methodology for this project was based on 2 different methods. It was based on the use of a questionnaire, and it was based on the use of interviews. And those interviews, because of safety reasons at the time, were conducted remotely using Zoom. The questionnaire included an open-ended question, which gave students the opportunity to describe the impact that they felt the simulations had on them and their experience of the laboratories. We had a question to collect some demographic data as well. And then the majority of the rest of the questionnaire was based on Likert statements. So we were seeking levels of agreement, basically. And those Likert statements were based on the Likert statements that we used in our pilot project. So they included questions on student confidence, questions on how students got support, and also questions about how students engaged with the simulations themselves. So that was an adapted version of the questionnaire we originally used in Leicester for the first study. The interviews, they were conducted by one researcher. They were conducted by Stephen, and that helped to show consistency, obviously. All of the interviews were transcribed into NVivo, and then they were subjected to thematic analysis. I'll talk a little bit more about how we did that as a team in a little while. The interviews did 2 different things for the project. So they were primarily set up initially to verify the validity and reliability of the questionnaire. So we were asking them to repeat their answers to the questionnaire questions and then to explain the reasoning. We asked them to describe their understanding of the question and to explain their reasoning for choosing their given answer. And that was primarily as a measure of reliability and validity. We also used that interview as an opportunity to get more context for the answers given. The students were justifying their answers, so it gave us a chance to dig a little deeper, if you like. We also asked some additional questions that didn't form part of the questionnaire, and that gave us some additional context about their experience of working in the lab and working through the practical course at that time. So in terms of how this was done logistically, the questionnaire was distributed in physical form in both of the classes, including the 2020 class. It was distributed in the last lab class of each year, and participation was entirely optional. So in 2019, 598 questionnaires were distributed to students and 519 responses were collected. So we had an 87% response rate relative to the number of questionnaires distributed. In 2020, 712 questionnaires were distributed and we had 419 responses received. So that was a 59% response rate, which we believe was depressed slightly as a consequence of the pandemic and the different challenges that people were facing in their lives, so it made them less likely to engage with this kind of research. The data analysis, so the top level response comparing the 2019 and the 2020 cohorts, that was done using a Pearson chi-squared. We measured the effect size in the differences using Kramer's V. And we looked at the interview transcript using thematic analysis, as I said earlier. So the thematic analysis was done as a team. So there were 4 researchers working on this. So Stephen and Shane at the University of New South Wales, and it was myself and Richard Blackburn at the University of Leicester. And what we did, we worked through a small number of the interview transcripts collectively as a team in order to ensure internal consistency. So we did that as a calibration exercise, essentially. Once we had done that, once we had calibrated our coding methodologies, we then allocated different transcripts to different people, split the task up, we divided it between the 4 of us. And that made it an achievable task, because the interview transcripts were quite long. And even though the total number of interviews was fairly small, we only did full interviews with 9 students, I think. So even though we only had a relatively small number of participants in that phase of the study, the length of the transcripts made it a very, very substantial activity. And I know those of you who have done coding from interview transcripts will know the amount of effort, the time and work that goes into that. So it's a very, very challenging activity. So when we compared the cohorts, when we looked at the Likert scale responses, there were 2 different statements that registered statistically significant differences between the 2019 and the 2020 cohorts. So on these charts here, you can see the 2019 responses are shown in blue, 2020 shown in orange. And confidence in operating analytical instruments without support or unaided, that was different between the 2 cohorts. You can actually see this slightly higher agreement pre-pandemic, pre-COVID-19 in 2019. In terms of enjoyment of completing the practical work, you can see the opposite effect. You can see that the enjoyment seems to increase after the pandemic. And if you think about the enjoyment, there's probably a very good reason for that. And that's because the students haven't been allowed in the lab part of the academic year as a consequence of the COVID-19 mitigation. So when they were allowed back into that lab environment, when they were invited to come back in and invited to do those experiments, they were really, really keen. They were really excited to be there. They also had access to the simulations, which gave them more opportunity to better prepare for that lab experience. So when we compare the different cohorts and when we compare the responses of the students in those different cohorts, whoops, there we go, went too far there. That's it, back to where it should be. So when we compared the responses from those different cohorts, and we look at 2020 class and 2019 class, we noticed that students were potentially feeling a little bit more intimidated about working in the lab environment in 2020 compared to 2019. So we've got this anxiety about the unfamiliar environment, fear of breaking equipment, so some of the stuff we saw with some of the early studies we did at Leicester. So I'm scared if I could not pass the experiment or make a silly mistake, and then the demonstrator knows I'm doing that, and they'll be telling me off for not doing it right and taking marks off me. So that's quite an interesting finding, that there's this apprehension, and that's presumably related to that lack of practical experience during the tough restrictions of the pandemic. The confidence levels that we measured in 2020 were quite bimodal. We had some students who were desperately lacking in confidence. We had some students who were extremely confident. We didn't have many in the middle. Students in 2020 were a little bit less sure about the difficulty of the tasks that they did in the lab. So they were a little bit less committal, if you like. And that's possibly because the structure of the lab activities were changed slightly because of lower lab capacities, because of less opportunities to share equipment. So as a consequence of that, they were doing a slightly different type of lab program to students in previous years. And they were made a little bit more straightforward, I suppose. They were made a little bit easier to follow for students. And that might be why we got that unexpected response there. So of the 2 classes, only the 2020 class had access to the learning science simulations. And when we look at the responses to the questions that focus specifically on those simulations, we see that the student response is very positive. So students engaged with the simulations multiple times for each experiment, and they had good recall of their experience of engaging with those. Students also felt that the simulations worked well in tandem with the videos. So the combination of video and simulation was the desired product that the students wanted. And they were very keen to tell us that they felt that the performance in those simulations should not be assessed. Otherwise, the way they engaged with them would change significantly and they would make a lot less use of them. Students were also very clear that the simulations cannot replace the in-person experience. So they can't replace the experience of going in the lab and doing the experiment, and they can't replace the support that they get from their postgraduate demonstrators when working on an experiment. And they were overwhelmingly positive about how useful the postgraduates were in doing the experiment. So they were very keen to tell us this is not a way of essentially automating the feedback and support process. So in terms of the responses to different phases of the interview, we broke this down depending on whether we had statements that students majority agreed, statements that students were kind of neutral on, or statements that students were largely disagreeing with. And there was majority agreement with engaging with the simulations as many times as I need to get the right answer, which is great. 70% of students did that. A majority agreement that when attempting the experiment in class, I used the feedback from the simulation. 63% of the respondents said that. Motivation to use the simulations as the feedback tool told me where I made mistakes. 71% agreed with that. And motivated to use the simulations because the feedback tool told me where I was correct. That was almost the same. It was 68% agreement with that. And you can see some example responses from the interviews on the right-hand side to justify those responses. And I love the third one, the one where it says about the feedback on the mistakes. I love the quote there. You can do all the stupid things that you should not do in a lab. And that is one of the things we were really hoping to achieve. We were really hoping to give students a safe environment where they felt free to learn from their mistakes. And that's exactly what this student has reported back. So that was a wonderful, wonderful quote. I really enjoyed that one, really enjoyed reading that one. And at the top, the first one says something quite similar too, actually. The first one says you could do it multiple times and nothing happens. You can just keep doing it, and it's all good, which reflects the fact that you're allowed to do it as many times as you like until you get to that correct point. With the neutral responses, we had 29% neutral on I engage with the simulations multiple times since I know I'm not being assessed. So this was very split between agree, neutral, and disagree. So if you look at that first quote, if it's marked, then you will not intentionally choose a wrong answer, right? So instead, if it's marked, you'd be more cautious in what you're answering. So this is what we feared. We were worried that if we assessed these, it would change students' behavior when they engaged with them. I prefer the simulations to the equivalent video instruction, 31% neutral on that. So again, there was a good split, about a third in each of the categories, agree, neutral, and disagree. I went for neutral on that because I think they're both important, to be honest. So that was a very typical type of response that we got there. Majority disagreement. So there's only one in that category. I prefer the simulations rather than a demonstrator. 60% majority disagreement there. I think the simulation is very fixed and it's not flexible as a real experiment. So I think one of the things that was coming out, one of the themes that was coming out from the discussions that students were having with Steve and about demonstrator interaction was the flexibility and the ability of the demonstrator to adapt to the circumstances of the specific experiment, whereas the simulation can't necessarily do that if an unanticipated mistake or error occurs. This is a summary of the thematic analysis from the interviews. So again broken up into things that were generally positive impact on students, things that had no impact on students, and things that gave a mixed experience. So good functionality of the simulations was reported in 132 of the responses. So the fact that simulations were very helpful in showing a more visual simulation of practicals without actually being in the lab, helping prepare students for experiments by showing what would and wouldn't work, ability to learn from mistakes and learn from them. 82 responses raised the fact that the simulations helped ease students into the laboratory experience. And you can see from the quotes there, it talks about preparation for the lab sessions, and it talks about efficiency as well. Reduced anxiety came up in 27 responses. So making practical easier prepares me for what is to come, makes me less nervous for when I'm conducting my practical. And then 13 responses had a bit of a caveat. So while they were generally positive, they had a bit of a sting in the tail, as we would say in the UK. So they were mostly positive, but then would come out with something slightly negative at the end of their response. But an example of one here where a student has given quite a positive response that isn't shown here, but then at the end of it, they've said, but ultimately they can't replicate an in-person lab experience, which actually I think is a really reassuring bit of reflection from the student. No impact, so only 36 responses stated that simulations had no impact. 24 of those said that there was no clear value of the simulations. So the example quote there says that the simulations were quite forgettable for that person, and that they felt that the face-to-face practicals were much better to actually pick up the nuances of the experiments with the demonstrators. The disconnect between the virtual environment and the real environment was raised by... Hello? Oh, sorry.
Sorry, no problem.
Okay. Yeah, 14 responses raised the difference between the virtual environment and the real environment. And that's because they felt that there was a little bit of a disconnect between what was being shown in the simulations and what it looks like in real life and how it works in real life. And then for mixed experience, 33 responses, all of which fall into the category of flawed, but provide at least some practice. So they felt they could be better, but they said it gives at least some useful guidance for the practicals. So the key conclusions from this phase of the study, it looked at the experience of the laboratory, student experience of laboratory through consideration of the effective domains of their learning, the cognitive load induced by the learning environment, and the level of interaction with the simulations. Techniques have a positive impact on student experience in general, but it's unclear if students are becoming technically more competent or whether they are just increasing their confidence, whether they're going through a kind of Dunning-Kruger, they don't know what they don't know type effect. So I'm just going to wrap up with a few slides showing you what we did at Leicester during the pandemic. Now, this is actually contextualized for CPBL rather than for laboratory teaching, but what we did for the labs is actually very, very similar to this. And what I did for my PBL sessions, my CPBL sessions are very face-to-face based. They're very much based on contact time. So I wanted to replicate that experience, that environment, in a virtual context. So in order to do that, I had to develop a digital collaborative platform. I had to adapt the timescales that students had to work on PBL activities to meet the demands of the challenging circumstances that students and staff were going through. And I had to provide improved support for students working on these problems. So we worked on developing digital environments that supported collaborative working. And I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to talk about it through a CPBL lens, but actually what we did for the dry experiments that we ran for the lab is almost identical to this. The CPBL gave students more time to work together. So for example, our initial this is the learn on the move problem that I talked about back in the first session. The learn on the move problem took a few weeks when we did it as a face-to-face activity. When we did it remotely, I gave students 10 weeks to work on it because I recognized they had a lot of different things to balance in their lives while they were studying remotely. They didn't have much access to campus. They didn't have access to speak to lecturers face to face. They needed more time and they needed more support. So we took a 2-year-long activity. We stretched it out to run for the entire term. The timeline shown on the right-hand side here. I published details of this earlier this year in the Journal of Chemical Education in a paper called VPBL, Developing a Facilitated Approach to Problem-Based Learning. The digital platform that I developed was actually based on some existing tools that we had available at Leicester. So we held team meetings for the VPBL groups in Blackboard Collaborate Ultra, and we left those rooms open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So we had scheduled meetings at certain times, but we left them open so that students could meet in those rooms whenever they wanted to. We gave them the flexibility to be able to meet and catch up with each other and discuss progress at a time that suited them between the formal scheduled meetings. The room had a variety of different collaborative tools, including file sharing, whiteboards, screen sharing, things the students at that point probably hadn't used very much of, because we're talking about 2020, we're talking about the early stages of the pandemic. Teams were encouraged to make use of the 24/7 functionality by arranging meetings between the scheduled ones. The actual team collaboration, so working on documents and generating products, we gave students access to Microsoft Office 365, but we also gave them access to some tools in Collaborate Ultra, and they were encouraged to basically find a solution that worked best for them. So we provided them with some tools, but we said it's actually fine for you to go away and use Google Docs if you want, or to use any other platform that allows you to collaborate together. Use something that you're comfortable with, use something that you're familiar with. The submission of work was handled through the university's digital submission platform, which is a bit of software developed by Turnitin, and that software is called, you know what, I've actually forgotten what it's called. It's not called Turnitin, it's not called Quickmark either. I can't remember what it's called. I'm really sorry about that. But it's a piece of software developed by Turnitin that allows students to submit their work and to have it assessed digitally so we could annotate it online. So the impact of these interventions, the teams were encouraged to make use of digital tools for specific tasks. And what I did, I measured use of these digital tools by the group of students doing the VPBL. I measured use of the same tools by students who had not yet encountered VPBL. So they were just doing lectures at the time. I actually found very little difference between them. I actually found negligible differences in usage of those tools between the two different cohorts that I investigated. The biggest difference was in instant messaging, where there was about 5 to 6% basic usage from the VPBL cohort. For the Collaborate Ultra room, you'll notice that 78.3% of the students doing VPBL used it, 0% of the students doing lectures used it, and that is because it wasn't available to students doing lectures. So there's a little caveat there, there's a little footnote to add there. So basically, for the technologies used to collaborate between contact sessions, there was actually very little difference in the platforms that they were using. However, when we looked at sessions that we used during the contact sessions, then we start to see some quite substantial differences. So at this point, we get quite big differences in the use of video chat and audio chat and file sharing and desktop sharing between the VPBL cohort and the cohort who had only studied by lectures. The lectures were quite interactive. There were questions, there were workshop activities, lectures encouraged students significantly in the VP. So the differences VPBT use of and some of the more digital tools during VPBL sessions compared to lectures. The student self-reported levels of transferable skills development were at least as good in the VPBL cohort than they had been in the pre-pandemic cohorts. So I compared the 2021 with the previous 2 academic years, and you can see agreement that they had developed those skills. It actually does increase slightly for those differences there. So it certainly didn't damage their ability to develop those important transferable skills. In terms of new opportunities, in terms of things that I've kind of learned from operating that system for a year during the 2020-21 academic year, I think it's a good precedent for developing new online PBL approaches. So if we wanted to generate new remote PBL activities, I think that could be a really good way of doing it. It provides us with a little bit of additional resilience. It provides us with an additional kind of fallback plan when something does go wrong. So if there's another pandemic, if there is another set of circumstances which means we can't teach on campus face to face, then we have a backup plan. We have something we can do instead. Excuse me. And I think the last one is the one I'm most excited about, actually. And I think this accidentally created potentially a lot more opportunities for collaboration between different universities and between different locations. So what I'm hoping to work towards, and this is something I'm starting to talk to people about, is the development of multi-institutional and even international collaborative PBL activities, where we get students in different geographical locations to work together in a single team by putting them together using methodology, so using digital technology. I think that will legacy of this work that was done during the pandemic, if we could achieve that. So that is something I'm really interested in, and I'm already having conversations with people about working with partners in other universities at the moment. So that's all I had to say for today, actually, and that's the end of the free lecture series, really, isn't it? And I guess I'm going to like to this acknowledgement list was written quite a long time ago, actually. There's quite a lot of people in addition to this that I need to thank, and I'll try my best to add those to the list as we go through. So the Royal Society of Chemistry and the National HE STEM programme have funded all I have done. And actually the Royal Society of Chemistry continues to be a great sponsor and supporter, as they've recently funded me to do a new project which is running this academic year. At Leicester, I've worked with lots of great colleagues, Barbara, Richard, who worked on the lab simulations project, Derek, who is a physicist who developed a lot of the original PBL activities that were used at Leicester. Di Davis was the head of teaching in chemistry at Leicester when I started working there, and he was always very supportive. Sarah Simmons, who used to be at Leicester, she's now at McMaster. She's also a physicist, and she was really helpful in kind of teaching me about context and problem-based learning. Johnny, he was at Leicester when I started working there, and he was actually my line manager, so he was my mentor, I suppose, but for my first 2 years at Leicester. He's now at Tokyo. Giro co-authored some of the PBL resources with me about 10 years ago. He's now at Technische Universität Bergakademie Freiburg in Germany. Kevin is my regular industrial co-author. He works for his own company, which is KKI Associates, based up in Edinburgh in Scotland. Obviously, all of our students are our trial partners. I can't list all of our M.Chem and BSc project students because there have been too many of them, but we've had a few who have authored resources with us, including Abhishek Ladwa, who recently authored a paper on the impact of the pandemic on student learning. We had Georgia Battersby and Corey Bealey a few years ago, who were BSc project students who authored a paper on a card game. Obviously, my 2 PhD students, first one of whom has obviously graduated and is very familiar with you all. So Erlina, who did an absolutely outstanding job of helping to develop the culture of research at Leicester, I think, and we learned so much from your time at Leicester, Erlina. So I really want to thank you for that.
Thank you. My pleasure, Dylan.
No problem at all. You know, it was so important to our development as a group, I think, and you know, you made so many valuable contributions to our published work and to the culture and the environment of the group as well. And we have a new PhD student who started last October, Harvey Broad, who he was actually one of the co-authors on one of the card game papers as well, from some work he did a very long time ago when he was a first-year undergraduate, and he's just submitted his first author J.Chem Ed, so we're keeping our fingers crossed that we get that published. So hopefully he'll be in the literature. Sorry, I've been talking too long. Hopefully he will be in the literature very soon. Very sorry about that.
That's okay.
Sarah Gretton and Cheryl Herkett at Natural Sciences have been fantastic too. And obviously all my new colleagues at Birmingham, including Laura Hancock, who's an expert in team-based learning, and John Snape, who's our head of education. Before my voice completely goes, I'm going to stop talking, take another drink of water so I can answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dylan. So at first I will translate a few of your presentation about virtual laboratory. Actually, this is about your research, right? Yeah, it's all about your research that you have.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's it.
From 2017 to until 2020.
That's right. Yeah.
Ya, oke. Jadi saya terjemahkan dulu sedikit. Jadi ini sebenarnya yang dibicarakan, yang dijelaskan, dipresentasikan oleh Dylan tadi, Dr. Dylan, itu sebenarnya adalah riset yang sudah dia lakukan semenjak tahun 2017 sampai 2022 ya. Banyak sekali kalau kita lihat tadi artikel yang sudah dikembangkan, dipublikasikan berkaitan dengan pengembangan media, terutama yang berkaitan dengan laboratorium lab simulasi, simulasi lab gitu ya. Jadi memang dari awal memang semenjak saya jadi student di sana, memang Dylan ini memang udah aktif sekali melakukan penelitian ya. Waktu itu dapat grant. Jadi ini adalah salah satu grant yang dia dapatkan ketika menjadi dosen. Dan ini jadi mulai dari PBL sampai ke sini. Tadi kalau kita lihat presentasinya sudah menggabungkan antara pendekatan PBL dengan sampai ke gamification ya, yang kemarin yang season kedua sampai yang sekarang ke lab simulasi. Nah, lab simulasi ini merupakan bagian dari virtual lab tadi. Nah, yang dikembangkan, yang dijelaskan tadi itu sangat lengkap, yang mulai dari alasannya, backgroundnya, kenapa ini dilakukan, ya, apa efeknya ke siswa, kenapa ini harus dikembangkan, sampai tadi dibicarakan juga tentang apa yang dikembangkan, terus kemudian impaknya kepada mahasiswa, terus studinya, jadi mulai dari kuantitatif sampai kualitatif data semuanya disajikan oleh Dylan. Jadi memang lab simulasi ini memang bukan hanya dikembangkan pada saat pandemi, ya, walaupun memang kegunaannya bisa kita rasakan. Jadi karena memang di Leicester itu memang sudah dilakukan dari mulai tahun 2017 ya, atau mungkin yang sebelumnya itu adalah penelitian tentang PBL yang mulai tahun 2017 sampai yang 2022 itu memang berkaitan dengan lab simulasi, lab simulation. Nah, jadi yang dikembangkan itu tadi memang dengan apa ya, untuk membantu siswa belajar, untuk membantu mahasiswa belajar atau siswa SMA belajar bagaimana cara menggunakan alat-alat di lab, bagaimana cara melakukan praktikum gitu. Jadi memang kalau kita lihat tadi, dan tadi sudah dipresentasikan juga lab simulation yang sudah dikembangkan, saya rasa itu sangat-sangat itu ya, kalau kita lihat ya sangat-sangat konseptual dan sangat-sangat menarik gitu. Jadi kalau kita bisa diklik semuanya, terus apa yang terjadi kita bisa cek, terus kalau ini lepas apa yang terjadi. Nah, harapannya memang dari situ memang siswa benar-benar bisa belajar. Kalau menurut saya kalau lab simulasinya seperti ini memang benar-benar bisa digunakan untuk belajar tentang kimia gitu atau praktikum gitu. Jadi kita tinggal tambahkan. Nah, apalagi yang tadi tadi juga sudah dibicarakan juga ya tentang apa itu tadi berapa efeknya ya, tadi mulai pendekatan analisis datanya juga sudah ditambah. Nah, untuk selama pandemi, nah penelitian yang seperti ini memang sangat bermanfaat gitu ya untuk pandemi karena memang gitu. Jadi memang betul-betul bisa digunakan gitu ya. Nah, tetapi memang nggak hanya pada saat ini bukan maksudnya Dylan ini tidak melakukan penelitian ini pada saat pandemi aja, tapi memang sudah sebelumnya. Tetapi hasil penelitian ini sangat bermanfaat pada saat pandemi. Nah, tadi juga dibicarakan beberapa mulai dari scaffoldingnya ya. Jadi kalau misalnya siswa belajar dengan simulasi lab ini seperti apa gitu ya hasil belajarnya gitu. Nah, mungkin itu silahkan nanti kalau ada pertanyaan bisa ditanyakan langsung atau menuliskan di kolom chat atau nanti atau bisa menggunakan langsung fitur raise hand ya. Kalau mau menggunakan fitur raise hand silahkan. Jadi tinggal angkat tangan aja atau nanti silahkan menuliskan di kolom chat. Nanti akan saya bacakan dan akan saya, kalau misalnya dalam bahasa Indonesia nanti akan saya translate gitu. Silahkan kalau ada pertanyaan. Is there any question related to Dylan's presentation? Actually, Dylan, it's really interesting. You know, what you're talking about is really interesting. In the term of, it's really complete. It's really detailed and really from the beginning until the end. You're talking about what is the impact, what is the reason why we have to develop this lab simulation, yeah, and the scaffolding as well. I think it's really nice reason to be one of the reason why we have to develop the lab simulation. Maybe just to encourage the participant to ask. I think I will ask you something.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, probably there is they will ask another question after this. And we know that what kind of factor, what factor that should we consider if we want to develop an animation video or maybe a lab simulation? Because we know that in chemistry, when students learn chemistry, most of students perception is chemistry is really it's hard based on this based on the numerous research reported. So what you develop is, I think it's really nice and it's really easy to use. But in Indonesia, especially in our department, we are trying to develop a kind of media or learning resource, teaching resource to make the learning process is engaging. So what factors that we have to consider?
I think most important thing for me is to keep it very focused on one theme. So make sure any resource that you develop is as simple as it can possibly be. Because if you look at this one, for example, we're showing a rotary evaporation here, and this is focused entirely on setting up the rotavap. There's nothing else involved in the simulation. We don't show the student how to collect the sample afterwards. We don't show the student how to clean the apparatus afterwards, because we could do that in separate simulations. So what we've tried to do is to commission simulations that are focused on very, very narrowly specified activities. So that if the student is in the lab and they think, I've got to rotavap my sample now, I've got to get this, I've got to remove the solvent. I've forgotten how to do that though, because I haven't done it for a year. I'm going to go to the computer and watch the simulation, do the simulation. And I know it'll only take me as a student maybe 5 minutes to do that simulation because it's so focused and straightforward. So for me, it's always about keeping it down to the absolute essential details and not putting anything that's not needed in there.
Yeah. I can see that it's really it's only one concept. Yeah, it's only a simple concept that we want to deliver to students so they can understand. So
that's it.
And
I mean, I think the feedback is essential as well. So giving feedback whenever they go wrong. So having customized feedback for each possible mistake, that's really useful. That's really, really helpful. And I think having some representation that at least vaguely mirrors what they're going to encounter in the lab environment is good as well. Having something that looks approximately like the same type of apparatus that they're going to use in the lab environment, that's quite important as well, because you know, we could have set this up in a very different way, and we could have had something that reflected different methods, different apparatus to what we use in Leicester, and I think that would have been very difficult to relate for our students back to what they do. Yeah.
What kind of the application that you use to, or maybe coding, what kind of to make this simple but amazing?
I'm delighted to say I didn't have to do any coding, because I think you could have predicted what a disaster that would have been. My mind isn't geared that way. So it was actually our partners at Learning Science that developed them. So what we do, we talk with Learning Science about the vision that we've got for the simulation. We talk about an experiment or a technique, and we talk about what the common mistakes students make when they do that technique. Learning Science themselves are experts in coding, they're experts in computation, but actually most of them have got chemistry degrees as well. So most of them are chemists. They've got some who are experts in other scientific areas as well. So when we talk to them about chemistry experiments, we're talking to a chemist who will understand, and they know they do a pretty good job of building something that reflects our requirements, if you like. And then they'll share a preview version with us that we get to approve before we say, yeah, we're going to use that. But yeah, ultimately, none of the coding got done by us at Leicester. So that was all done by Learning Sciences in Bristol. So that was good for us.
So is it free to use?
It's not, no, we had to pay for it. So one of the reasons we did so much research on it was actually to convince the university that it was right to invest in it, because we needed evidence it was helping students, basically.
Yeah, it's really nice actually. I know Learning Sciences, when we have the conference, they always give us the.
That's right. Yeah.
Their business card, right?
Yeah, and they still come to all the conferences in the UK. They were at the ones I went to in the summer. They were there.
Okay. I'm sorry, Dylan. I need to wait a minute.
That's all right.
So for the user, should we pay for when we want to access learning sciences?
it's essentially a subscription. It's an
Oh, I
institutional
see.
subscription. So from the user perspective, from the student perspective, they log into the virtual learning environment for the university and they click through a link. So it's seamless for them. It just looks like it's part of the VLE for the student perspective. The institution pays for the subscription so that anyone on campus or anyone remote who is logged in as a university user can access it.
Okay. So, okay, there is one question from Miss Ira Lestari. Interesting how you make a simulation on an experiment. I just want to know what kind of tools that you use. Yeah, I just asked you that they were to make a smooth simulation. So actually, Dylan is already answering. Yeah. So
yeah, we use someone else's tools that we don't need to learn about.
jadi sebenarnya tim risetnya tidak membuat sendiri gitu ya. Jadi kita menggunakan
Cegaman.
Oke, tolong dimatikan dulu. Oke. Nah, jadi aplikasinya ini yang bukan pakai aplikasi atau tidak menggunakan coding sama sekali. No coding at all. So no application. So basically hanya karena ada partnernya jadi learning sciences. Kalau di UK itu ada, memang dia expertise-nya, keahliannya memang di bidang membuat virtual laboratory atau yang segala sesuatu yang berkaitan dengan itu. Jadi memang pihak learning sciences yang membuat, kemudian pihak peneliti hanya sebagai kira-kira apa sih requirement, apa sih syarat-syarat yang harus dimasukkan, terus apalagi yang main konsep ya, konsep apa sih yang mau disampaikan ya. Sebelum digunakan baru dicek lagi apakah sudah benar atau tidak, baru setelah itu digunakan gitu. Tadi yang sudah disampaikan Dylan gitu. Nah, untuk yang tadi faktor-faktor apa sih kira-kira yang harus dikembangkan gitu ya, harus dipertimbangkan ketika kita mengembangkan suatu media gitu ya. Paling pertama itu adalah harus simple kata Dylan tadi. Jadi simplicity, jadi jangan terlalu banyak. Makanya kalau dilihat ini ya, video ini misalnya ini hanya menggambarkan tentang satu konsep aja gitu. Jadi tidak kayak seperti tadi destilasi aja gitu. Jadi memang karena kan ini interaktif ya, jadi banyak yang bisa diklik-klik gitu ya. Jadi memang tidak usah terlalu banyak konsep yang dimasukkan karena itu akan membuat jadi agak rumit gitu. Tetapi satu konsep, tapi mereka bisa mengecek. Terus kalau misalnya ini dilepas terus gimana gitu. Jadi bisa dicek jawabannya gitu ya. Jadi memang simplicity-nya memang harus kita, itu menjadi faktor utama gitu ketika kita mengembangkan suatu media gitu, atau terutama lab simulasi ini. Itu ada lagi pertanyaan yang lain? Silahkan. Ini udah yang terakhir ini ya, sesi yang terakhir dari Dylan, guest lecture. Kita pertemuan terakhir. Ini menurut saya sangat menarik dan ini mungkin bisa digunakan, maksud saya bisa menjadi dasar gitu ya ketika ini kan banyak mahasiswa ya yang akan mengembangkan, yang sedang melakukan penelitian. Ini bisa digunakan maksud dasarnya, reasonnya. Jadi mulai dari awal, bagaimana cara Dylan menjelaskan gitu ya, mulai dari latar belakangnya, terus apa yang dikembangkan, terus tadi pengolahan datanya, terus nanti juga artikelnya, mungkin nanti di bawah ini kan sudah ada kelihatan judulnya. Preparing students to practical session ya, using laboratory simulation software. Nah ini nanti mungkin bisa diakses, silahkan kalian akses. Mungkin bisa diakses menggunakan ResearchGate biar bisa dapat yang gratis. Nah, silakan dibaca gitu. Ini sebagai salah satu bahan yang bisa kalian gunakan untuk mengembangkan suatu media, ya. Nah, silakan. Actually, I just knew that there is your publication, but it's for Richard Blackburn, yeah?
So the first one we published was 2019. So that's Richard, Barbara, and myself. And then the second one was earlier this year, and that is with Stephen and Shane in Australia, plus Richard and myself.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So you already mentioned your paper, yeah, published in GCAMET.
Yeah, so there's the
Really
one that's
nice.
at the bottom. The one
It's
that's at the
really-
bottom of the screen there is the original one, and then I can't move it. And then hello. There we go. That's the other one. If anyone wants the citation, that's the one that came out this year, and that's based on the study in Australia.
Yeah. This one in Australia, right?
Yeah, New South Wales.
New South Wales. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because there's many participation, 900.
Oh yeah, no, huge number of
Really
students
huge number.
contributing to it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, really. You must be proud that you have a really huge data and information that you can.
It was
analyze.
incredible because you know what our student numbers are like. We would never be able to do that in the UK. So to work on a project like that was fantastic. It was amazing.
I think it's really interesting. Oh my God, it's almost 600, and this is more than 700. Yeah, for something like this, I think the response is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Because we want to know student respond after they using the simulation laboratory or something.
Yeah.
So it's really nice. Yes. Oke, ada lagi pertanyaan? Jika ada pertanyaan, silahkan langsung ditanyakan. Atau silahkan mengisi lembar presensi, ya. Silahkan pada setiap orang untuk mengisi, silahkan untuk melakukan presensi di link berikut. Kalau tidak ada pertanyaan, saya tutup aja ya. Dan kita move to Fadil, siap-siap. Halo Fadil. Yeah, okay. Wait a minute, I will close this session and return it back to you, okay? Okay, Dylan, thank you very much for your talks, and I think it's really interesting. I've never checked this for the last 2 years papers, but I think it's really nice to see your publication. I think I will start to read it.
Thank you.
This is the one thing that we want to develop in Indonesia. Actually, we want to make a simple but meaningful, for students to learn something. Yeah, I think. Yeah. Perhaps we could collaborate to something in our research. So we'll talk about it later on. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Terima kasih buat semuanya yang sudah bergabung. Pertanyaan yang sudah disampaikan. Saya tutup ini sesi ini. Saya kembalikan lagi ke Fadil sebagai pembawa acara untuk melanjutkan acara yang berikutnya. Okay, Dylan. We will have another. Kita akan menyerahkan ya. We will give you the certificate, but just for the symbolizer, and we will send it by email. Okay. So
thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome. So Adil, I will give it to you. The time is yours. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan.
Thank you, Dr. Dylan Williams, for the amazing material about helping students in the lab, especially in lab simulations. But moving on to the next session, which is certificate awarding, which will be represented by M.Eni Enawati, symbolically as the representative of the Chemistry Education Study Program. To M.Eni Enawati, the time is yours.
Mungkin Fadil bisa disampaikan itu, di-share dulu sertifikatnya. Yunita ya? Oke.
Baik, sudah boleh, Bu Elin, sudah boleh ngomong?
Silakan Bu, ya. I will translate it to you, Dylan.
Ya. Terima kasih untuk Dr. Dylan ya, yang telah mempresentasikan 3 kali berturut-turut ya, satu pembelajaran yang sangat berharga untuk kita semua ya, mulai dari problem-based learning, itu menjadi topik kita juga, dan untuk kita kembangkan di dalam pembelajaran. Dan hari ini pembelajarannya juga sangat bagus ya untuk lab simulasi. Nah itu juga bisa kita kembangkan untuk persiapan laboratorium. Saya juga sangat tertarik ya dengan pembicaraan hari ini, memberikan wawasan kepada kita untuk mempersiapkan mahasiswa sebelum ke lab. Nah itu bisa dengan lab simulasi ini. Terima kasih. Mungkin ini sertifikat yang bisa kita berikan. Sekali lagi terima kasih atas waktu yang telah diberikan untuk kita program studi kimia 3 kali berturut-turut ya. Itu kita sangat menghargai dan sangat berterima kasih. Itu aja Mbak Lin, terima kasih.
Thank you. Terima kasih Benny. Dylan, she is one of the head of department. We have 2 head of department actually. We have 2 programs in here. She is one of the head of department representing our head of department of chemical education program. So we really appreciate your time to give us to share your research, your thought and your expertise on context and problem-based learning in 3 times in series. Yeah, it's really nice and really good experience for us to have to share, because this is our first time to invite the international speaker. So we have that. We hope that this experience will give our student experience to get more insight and value from the international, from our global network or some. So really, thank you, Dylan. This is the certificate that we will send it to you. This is signed by our dean and our head of department, Mr. Professor Haji Martono and Mr. Rahmat Rasmawan. So we really thank you and appreciate your time, and you want to serve us really. It's a really great thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's been a great honor to be invited to do these talks, and I really enjoyed it. So thank you very much, and thank you for all the wonderful questions as well.
Ya, Dylan, terima kasih. Terima kasih, ini juga sangat merupakan kesempatan yang merasa terhormat ya, diundang untuk menjadi guest lecture, mengisi 3 kali ya. Jadi tentang context and problem based learning. Jadi dia juga merasa senang dan merasa bangga gitu ya, bisa berbagi. Gitu. Oke, thanks again Dylan, and I'll give it back to you, Fadil, to close this session. Thank you, Dylan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Dr. Dylan, for the amazing material. And we cannot doubt that this material Dr. Dylan brought is such an amazing material. It tells us that lab simulation really helps the students to improve their final result and confidence when they are in the lab. And Dr. Dylan also mentioned about the measuring impact regarding lab simulation to the result to the students' confidence and comprehension when entering and doing experiment in the lab. And thank you to the participants, lecturer, and invited guests who have taken the time to attend guest lecture this afternoon. Hopefully the material that have been presented can be useful, and hopefully we can meet at another time. So from me, if there are mistakes in words and actions, both intentional and unintentional, I apologize. We look forward to seeing you again, Dr. Dylan. And that's all from me. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Fadil. Thank you, Dylan.
Thank
I
you.
will send you an email about the certificate and about the research that we have talked earlier.
Yes. That'd be brilliant. Yeah.
I'm really sorry I haven't replied because due to our.
No, I know you must be really busy. That's fine.
We try to make it the outline, so we will send it to you as soon as possible.
Sounds great.
Yeah. Tomorrow I will leave. I will go to US. It's really, I'm interesting. I hope there
you
is.
You're going to Portland, is it?
Yes, Portland. I will see Jack Barbera.
Jack, yeah,
Yes.
fantastic.
I can't wait to see him, actually.
Oh, that will be brilliant. It'd be such a great experience to be
Yes,
working
of
there.
course.
Yeah,
Yes.
fantastic.
And
Well,
hopefully one day I will go back to England and see
yeah,
you.
that would be wonderful. Yeah, yeah. Well, have a safe journey and have a very enjoyable journey, and you'll love it over there. It's brilliant, and it's a great research group as well. So yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. See you again then.
See you. Bye.
Bye. Ya Bu En.
Oke, udah selesai kah?